Thank you so much, Doron, and thank you everyone for inviting me here, for organizing this wonderful conference. It's nice to be part of the home of Leo Baeck, and I'm very honored to participate. My talk today is unique in that it's the only paper to deal with a pre-modern period. As such, I would like to begin by explaining the significance of Jewish homes in the early modern period. This period, from about 1500 to 1800, witnessed many changes, among them the invention of movable type and the Protestant and Catholic Reformations. While these developments affected Jews and Christians alike, the Jewish population underwent an additional change. In the wake of expulsions from many urban centers, Jews in German-speaking lands found themselves living in a new demographic constellation, or actually more than one, which I'll speak about now. And the truth is that migration and movement are, of course, trends that affected many non-Jews as well, but Jews face these very unique circumstances. Some Jews moved to small villages, a significant number of which were home to only one or two Jewish families. Others were forcibly relocated from neighborhoods in the city center in which they had resided since the Middle Ages, displaced to ghettos or Judengassen. Judengassen were typically enclosed by walls with gates that were locked each night. By the mid-17th century, after the Peace of Westphalia, the Treaty of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War, Jews also settled in cities in which they had never lived before, such as Hamburg or Fürth. So Jewish living quarters and family arrangements varied greatly, both from one place to another and between classes in any given location. And the nature of where and how Jews lived depended on the often highly regulated legal policies governing Jewish residents. My paper today, based on my own research, as well as joint work I have conducted respectively with Verena Kasper-Marienberg and especially with Elisheva Karlbach in our new book, focuses on the Jewish home in two of these new constellations. First, the Judengasse, and then Jewish life in villages, which is really the two typical forms that we find for pre-modern German lands in the early modern period. For each of these types of communities, I will highlight the legal framework of Jewish homes, the dynamics within households, and the material aspects of the home, most notably spatial arrangements. I will conclude by briefly considering the connection between Jewish homes and identity. I begin my discussion with the Judengasse, particularly those of Frankfurt and Worms, which were established in the second half of the 15th century, and in which Jews were forced to reside through the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. And of course, ghettos are not limited to Germany, they're an early modern phenomenon, but I'm just going to focus on these two German cities. And I would like to note at the outset that Jews in Frankfurt and Worms were not permitted to own their homes. They rented their homes from the municipality, although this is a very tricky legal situation because the official renters are allowed to sublet space without permission and also to bequeath their homes as inheritance to their heirs. So while they're not legally owners, functionally, they really are like owners because they can bequeath them and do whatever they want within certain limits. Jews who lived in enclosed urban ghettos coped with intensely crowded houses, limited to spaces that could not expand according to the law, even as the Jewish population grew by leaps and bounds. In this regard, their living conditions differed manifestly from those of their urban Christian neighbors. And so if you look here at the slide of Frankfurt and its Judengasse, and you can see it in the red oval, I'm just going to walk over here for a minute. I hope you can all hear me. If you can't, I'll speak about it. If you look how densely populated these houses are compared to the other houses in the city, you can see these are much more narrow. There are just so many more people, and the shape of the home is very different. That affects so many dynamics that I'll be talking about today, but there's a real visual. This gets even more crowded. This is 1628. If you go forward to 1728 to 1750, the situation changes all the more so after the 1711 fire. We'll see this visually in a moment, but just to sort of have that visual of how much more cramped the quarters are. In Frankfurt, the Judengasse was 330 meters long, with incredibly narrow houses. The number of households living in one building continued to grow over a period of 3 centuries until eventually the lane housed over 3,000 Jews, so just in that area. While no new houses could be added, the Jews added spaces by dividing homes. In some cases, multiple unrelated families, 3, 4, 5, and sometimes even 9 families shared these cramped houses. And if you look, this is from the archive if you see houses built after 1711, when a very important fire ravaged the Judengasse, you can see here 4 different entrances in this narrow home. And so what you have here are many different families living in very, very narrow spaces. The same was true in Worms, even though the Judengasse was far less crowded and the Jewish community far smaller, numbering approximately 700 Jews in the 17th century. A visitation record from Worms, where the municipal authorities came to see who was living in what house, dated July 1610, documents the number of rooms in each of the 103 homes and the curved lane of Worms Judengasse. And you can see here a similar configuration with locked gates on the side in the blue oval. Many houses had cellars, this is an example of one of the cellars, and courtyards. All had a combination of heated and unheated rooms. The largest house, Zum Riesen, was home to 4 households, a couple and their 3 married sons and grandchildren. And that house had 5 heated rooms, 11 unheated rooms of varying sizes, 2 cellars, a courtyard, a stable, and 3 distinct kitchens. But most houses, I would say every other house that I looked at, were far more modest. For one example, Rivka and Chaim lived with their young son Sinai in a house with 2 heated rooms, 4 unheated rooms, a courtyard, and the vaulted cellar in which they likely stored wine, so it would have looked like the one on the screen. It was home also to Chaim's widowed mother and to his sister who had once been married to Hirsch, resident of the neighboring house, Zum Goldenrot. Another poor Jew lodged with the extended family as well. Multi-generational living was common among Christians as well, although it is notable that in the Jewish home, more distant relatives, boarders, and refugees also lived together with the Jewish families, since all Jews had to live in the Judengasse. So there's just a lot less leeway. Multiple families might share 1 or 2 heated rooms, and not every home had a separate kitchen. Shared spaces within the households affected the very rhythms of daily life. In the frigid winter months, the 1 or 2 warm rooms of the house had to be shared by extended families or by different households. Privacy as we know it today was not a possibility, and neighbors were privy to intimate details of one another's lives. Shared cooking spaces demanded that women who ran each household and the maidservants who cooked and washed pots and dishes coordinate with one another. The key role played by women in navigating dynamic households is transparent in the words of the 18th century Rabbi Pinchas Katzenellenbogen, who debated, once he was widowed, between living with his sister's daughter, Gittel, or with his brother's son, Saadia Isaac. And these are his words translated. Oh, 1 second. I'll come back to this slide. I am more inclined to go to the home of my sister's daughter, the lady Gittel, who is chaste and God-fearing, though I do not know her husband, Mr. Zalman Ber. And ever since he became connected to us by marriage, he has not inquired about me, although I have inquired as to his welfare in my letters addressed to my brother's son, Rav Saadia Isaac. He has never sent me a single letter in reply, and because of this, my soul is exceedingly bitter, and I have no inclination to write to him. So even though he has these very negative feelings towards his nephew-in-law, he decides that he's going to go live with them because the person who's really going to be taking care of him is his niece, Gittel. And he then describes in the continued quote how despite his hostile feelings, it would be Gittel who cared for him, and all of his needs, including his preferences for meals, which is quite astounding, and I would like to share it with you. Now in the mornings, I drink coffee with milk together with a breakfast loaf, a penny or a half, and for lunch, I eat as everyone else does. That is to say, on Sundays, the leftover of the cooked Sabbath meals, and on Monday and Thursdays, I habitually eat dairy foods, and on occasion, also meaty liquid dishes without meat. On Tuesdays and Wednesdays, I eat meaty soups plus meat, and on Fridays, whatever is available to me so as to avoid getting hungry. And at night, I eat nothing except for the nights of the new moon and special seasons and festivals, and you see here a Passover Seder from the same time. References such as these allow us a glimpse into the daily working of the household. Imagine he's going to board in a room, but he has this very interesting list of demands, and the daily workings of the household are not limited to the nuclear family. It perhaps comes as no surprise that conflict over shared spaces erupted rather frequently, particularly in the cramped spaces of the Judengasse. In the Vetter townhouse in Frankfurt, for example, Two widows, Rosla Schwarzschild and the unnamed mother of Yutzva Veterhan, swapped the upstairs and downstairs sections of the house every 3 years. So if you imagine that narrow house that I showed before, and it would have been split into an upstairs and a downstairs, they would have a lottery switching who was upstairs and who was downstairs, even though they were two separate households. Sharing spaces in this manner often led to conflicts, as it did when Rosla's brother inherited his sister's share of the house and quarreled with Yuspa over the terms of the lottery in a dispute that the rabbinical court eventually adjudicated. Among the terms stipulated in the Veterhan dispute was the use of the cellar and of the sukkah. Now I'll go back to the sukkah, which the court ruled were to be shared equally by both parties during the holidays. Many German homes had a roof from which shingles could be removed, and you see an example here modeled on Fiert from Paul Christian Kirchner, and you can see how the shingles can be removed on the lower house, or the actual roof could be lifted up to create space for the sukkah. And so living in the upper floor or having access to the sukkah was something that was battled very, very frequently, because this allowed residents to place branches on the square cross beams to construct a sukkah in what was normally a room in their home. Access to the upper floors during the fall months was therefore an advantage. Similarly, storage in the cellar could be critical for business or for Passover. Jewish women and men had to negotiate how to share these spaces in a divided house. In one Frankfurt home shared by the Schotten and Hain families, a dispute over space led to an agreement that while the Schotten parents, who resided upstairs, could access the Hain home to make their way to the toilets at night, as was customary, their children and their servants would have to use the toilets in the cellar. So it was really a question of who could go through whose house in the middle of the night. And when you're living in these cramped shared spaces, these daily necessities become really points of friction. Privacy of almost any type was impossible to obtain under such conditions. This crowding contributed to the grounds for lapses in sexual morality, particularly for servants who often slept in whatever spaces were available, and there was always a search for privacy, but it was not always successful. Cooking space was also limited in the narrow houses of Frankfurt. A small stove would have been tucked into the landing of a stairwell. And you see here a 19th century engraving, but it would have been similar since this is from the Judengasse, and you can see the little kitchen tucked underneath the stairwell, and the vapors would have been let out the window. This meant that Jewish families did not have ovens in which to heat their Shabbat food, and as such they used communal ovens in and proximate to the Judengasse, with maidservants carrying labeled pots. This is an amazing 18th century pot. You can see the name of the family on it. It also has a house symbol, which I'll talk about towards the end of the talk, which they would bring to the communal oven, and it's quite important that they were labeled so that you would know whose pot was whose, and the maidservant could go fetch the right pot. It also raises very interesting questions about literacy. It perhaps comes as no surprise that disputes over the price for placing larger pots in the oven also made their way to the imperial court. If the crowded Judengasse led to conflicts because of limited space, Jews living in rural villages faced very different conditions. While there were often limitations on where they could reside and whether they could own property, the quarters were not as cramped as in the cities. 17th century memoirist Asher Reichshofen from Alsace recalled, "The home that I built and acquired, I built 3 things within it. First, a small room to set aside time for Torah study and prayer, and to put my books in that I bought with my own money," meaning the books, not the house. Second, a small oven ready to bake matzot. And in this year, 1631, for the first time, I fulfilled my wish according to the custom of the medieval Rabbi Rokeach. I baked 3 matzot on Passover Eve. I warm up the same small oven every Friday to bake chalot and to store the chamin for Shabbat. Third, a small bathhouse behind the oven of the heated room of the Beit HaChoreth, and this is the cemetery in which he was probably buried. His son and his father are buried there. Gives you a sense of really the rural space, I hope. Unlike Frankfurt's communal ovens, Asher was able to install a private oven, although his was one of a handful of families in Reichshofen. Even in villages with more substantial Jewish populations, home life was very different than what I described in the Judengasse. Claudia Ulbricht's work on Steinbiedersdorf, the most important village in Lorraine, explains that Jews rented only entire houses from Christians, but also individual rooms within their homes. 1/3 of Jewish families, those from the upper class, owned their own homes, and others rented from them and from Christian landlords. The daily proximity between Jews and Christians led to different dynamics between neighbors of different faiths. In certain areas within southern German lands, including villages in Swabia, acquiring or building a house was a prerequisite to obtaining protected status and permission of residence. So this is entirely different from Frankfurt and Worms, where you can't own a home at all. Wealthier court Jews could afford to build homes and typically have capital left over, while less well-off Jews did not necessarily have assets beyond their physical home and the wares that they traded. Of course, rural and urban living were different for both Jews and Christians. So whether you live in a city or a village, and this, I think everybody here is well aware, is quite different. However, I would like to briefly consider what made a Jewish home different from a Christian home. First, a point about the intersection between Jews' legal statuses and homes. While both Christians and Jews employed servants, particularly young women who sought to earn money toward a dowry, Jews often had many more servants in both rural and urban areas. This was because service afforded poorer men and women not only a livelihood, but a place to live within a Jewish community as well. And this was very critical for Jews who lacked the formal right to residence in any Jewish community. If they were a servant, they had a place to live. They could live in someone else's household. In addition, in rural areas where houses could be shared by Jews and Christians, material goods and furnishings set Jews apart. Dishes and cutlery for meat and dairy, ovens for Shabbat food, such as that of Asher Weichshofen, set Jews apart from those residing in the very next room. Asher in particular explained that his bathhouse set him apart from Christian neighbors who bathed in mixed gender settings. By contrast, in deeply populated ghettos where Jews and Christians were separated, Jewish houses were so much more crowded, leading to tension between neighbors, as I described. I mentioned already the many conflicts between households sharing homes. I would simply add to this that poorer and wealthier Jews lived on the same street, often in the same houses. These narrow and crowded homes did not differ much from one another, especially since all of them were situated on the same narrow lane. In Frankfurt and Worms, for example, most homes could not function as status symbols, and the exceptions would be the large house, some reason that I mentioned earlier, or if you visited the Frankfurt Judengasse Museum, the Steiner's house, which was belonging to the stepson of the Wertheimer family, and so that house was much bigger, but otherwise the houses are very similar. That said, and this is sort of, I think, the place where the difference between material and imagined space really matters, the house emblems in which they were symbolically represented were used as a sign of prestige and identity. Instead of addresses, houses in these two Judengassen were marked with symbols. Jews derived their family names from these houses and adopted the house symbols as signs of elite status. On tombstones, and you see an example here from Frankfurt, the Birnbaum family, which had tree emblems on their epitaphs, which was the sign of their home. On other material items such as chanukiyot, on earrings, and on luxury goods. And this is just one example, a beaker from a society meant to help young poor boys be circumcised. All of these emblems in other communities are often signs of the zodiac, but here they're the signs of the house symbols of all of the charity collectors from Frankfurt. And this is a really fascinating phenomenon that sort of distinguishes between Jews and Christians, because Christians often name their houses after their family names, but Jews often name themselves after the names of their homes. To conclude, I have tried to provide a very brief overview of how new constellations of Jewish homes in the early modern period affected Jewish families, households, and identities. Legally restricted as to where they could live, Jews found ways to express their distinctive identities within the space of their homes. Their living conditions greatly impacted the dynamics within the household, and in crowded areas often led to conflict. Nevertheless, men and women found in their homes a space in which they could meet their needs. As Pinchas Katzenellenbogen described, he was looking for a room of his own. I need to have a special room for my own use, containing a bed, a table, a chair, and books, as well as an oven that I can heat up at times when the weather is cold. Though the rabbi's room would have been small, and he would have boarded in a relative's house, he hoped to furnish his room with the implements he needed for comfort and for his scholarly endeavors. The same might be said for many less famous men and women. A 17th century description of Frankfurt's crowded Judengasse refers to those who create a pleasant aroma in their homes, especially in the summer with lilies or roses. Undoubtedly placed there by Jewish women who sought to beautify the homes they managed, these flowers represent the ways in which Jews navigated the houses and rooms they were allotted, creating not just houses, but homes. Thank you.